In this video, we're going to be reviewing Adobe Photoshop for iPad that just came out last week. Now you can see here that I've got several Photoshops. There's this one called Photoshop Mix, Photoshop Express, Photoshop Fix. And I'm really not a fan of all these. I can see what Adobe is doing, trying to use their Photoshop name and get as much bang for their buck as they can. But all these little apps are just like little kind of toy apps in my opinion. The real one here is over to the left called Photoshop. So this is the app that we're going to be reviewing today. So I've just opened up here Photoshop, and this is just an image I pulled down from the internet from unsplash.com just to kind of demonstrate a couple of the features here. Now you can of course come to your home tab and you can create new blank files as well in your home tab. I've just got this. You can go ahead and just set the create new button, right, and come over here and create those. But I've just got this one open, which has this little JPEG. Now this is a fairly large JPEG. You can see it's fairly high resolution. You can use two fingers to pinch and zoom, and you can see it's pretty snappy, right? I'm on an iPad Pro here, which is their higher end iPad, so you would expect it to behave fairly well, and it definitely does with pinching. Now I've also got the Apple Pencil, so I'm going to be using the Apple Pencil to sort of demonstrate a few of these features here. But you'll quickly notice that there's just quite a few things that are missing from this Photoshop for iPad. So I'm going to quickly review the tools. So you have your basic select tool that's present. You have your transform tool where you can do basic transform, skews, perspective, and warps and whatnot inside of your transform settings. Rotations, you can do your flips and whatnot like you'd expect. I'll cancel out of that. You have your selection tool. And there's really only a couple of selection options you have. Notice that you do have your addition, your subtraction, and your intersection modes. So that's standard there with your feathering. But you only have lasso tool, square, and circle marquees. And then this one right here is the quick select tool. So the quick select tool has found its way over as well. So you can see I can, let's see if I wanted to try to cut this model out here. I could come in and start painting towards the edges and try to get a little selection here. Now, traditionally in Photoshop, right, you would paint what I call a garbage mat like this, a garbage selection, which is a rough selection. So you can see it got too much up there, and here's the first handy feature. You can see this little option down here. I can actually move this wherever I want on the screen, but this is kind of like a option key. So if you click and hold this, it switches me into minus mode, and then I can subtract up there where I selected too much. So that's kind of what that feature allows for you to do. Let go and you're back in addition mode. So I'm just going to quickly paint out the rest of this here. And so traditionally you would get your selection right like so, and then you would refine it. But notice there is no refine selection. So I can just create a mask. I mean, I can turn on a mask of that, but notice how rough, see how rough that edge is? And that's because there's no refining. You can't refine a selection once you've created it, which is a huge problem, right? When you're working with a document, you're not able to modify that selection edge. So that's kind of an issue there, but you do have the quick select tool. You have just one single brush tool, and the brush itself has brush tips. So if you click and hold, you can see there's all these different brush tips. There's just a few that are built in. You can't customize the brush. There's no brush settings, but the brush does work and it is pressure sensitive. So let's go ahead and come over to my layers panel, and I'm going to create a new layer on top of this. Whoops, right here, create a new layer. So I don't brush this out, and we'll just grab here. And the brush size is with this guy right here. So I can increase and decrease. Oh, whoops, I'm on the opacity. Brush size is this one. So there's my brush size. So, you know, you can just come in here and paint away. It is pressure sensitive, so as I push and hold, it will get bigger and smaller. You have to have that option toggled on, which I thought I actually already did. Let's come into this brush tip up here. Maybe this one will have it built in. No, somewhere I've got that turned off. I'm actually not even sure. Maybe it's in here. There we go. Use pressure for size. I had that toggled off. So now I can come in here and you can see I can do lightly, or I can push very hard and light and hard. So it does have the pressure sensitivity that's built into the Apple Pencil as well. So that is nice. And you can see you have a few settings here for your brush. Like you can do angle and roundness, but you don't have all those additional settings where you can control jitter and all those sort of things like that. So that's your brush settings. This is the eraser tool. It basically has all the same stuff as the brush, but it erases. Again, a nice feature is if you're brushing, you can click this option here to go into subtraction mode, and then it turns into an eraser where you can then erase. So that works just fine. You have over here, you have your paint bucket and your gradient tool. So you can do solid fills, of course, or you can come in here and switch over to gradient mode. And between your foreground and background color, you can pull in a gradient. So that is it for gradients. Notice that there's no gradient stops. There's no opacity stops. You can't control any of that stuff. You just have a gradient from 2 colors. That's it. You can't even add multiple stops here in your gradients. So that's definitely a bit of a problem. So as far as the healing brush goes, you have a basic healing brush. Let's actually delete this layer up here. I'm going to select this layer, and we're going to come into our layer properties and just delete this. So we can go back here to our model. So I can come in and I can grab my healing brush tool. Now there's not a lot to heal here, but let's try to, oh, whoops, I did not want to do that. That's actually the eraser tool. So we clip up here to undo, grab the healing brush. So let's get this little spot right here and heal right there and let go. And you can see, sure enough, I'll undo that. So there's before, there's after. So the healing brush works just the same, but you only have the single healing brush. It's just basically the spot healing brush. You do have your clone stamp. Again, here's where we can use this option key. I can click and hold, and I can set the source right here. And then I can come up here and clone. So the clone stamp works the same way as it does in Photoshop, but there's not all the options. So all you have is using all layers or current layer and below, but you don't have any of the clone options. For example, I can't set the size. I can't set the rotation. None of those features exist in here of the clone stamp either. And then apart from that, I mean, it's basically you can do basic crops. You can add some text with your text tool and come in here and type. So you have your text tool, and you have, you know, all the various, you can of course choose your fonts and whatnot, and then your font size and color and a few of those paragraph options. But you're pretty limited on what you can do with text. There's no text kerning. There's no small caps, all those features of the text tool. None of that exists inside of here. You just basically have basic text and basic colors with your paragraph styles. So that is the text tool, but it at least has basic type built in there. And then you have your images. So I can click the images and I can select from my files or my camera roll or your Creative Cloud library. We have our eyedropper tool, and that's pretty much it. So that's all the tools. There are no additional tools. Now really quickly here, we'll just come over to the right hand side. So they have this little, I don't know what you would call this, a small layer preview. So if you have a lot of different layers here, let's actually just go ahead and add a bunch. You can see they're all in this little sort of small preview. And if you have a whole bunch, you can just scroll between them like so. I prefer this large preview here where it kind of shows the traditional layer. Now one feature which is kind of nice on touch is if I swipe right on the layer, it highlights multiple layers. And if I swipe right again, it deselects those. So I can swipe on 3 or 4, and then I can drag those layers over as a unit to wherever I want, or I can say group those all, and it will group all those layers like so. So that's kind of a nice little touch feature that works really well. If you don't want to swipe, you can also come into your settings and use what they call multi-select inside of here. And there it is, begin multi-select mode. And that actually gives you the little check boxes where you can highlight multiple layers and, you know, group them or link them or whatnot. So that is multi-select inside of there. Let's go ahead and, so I'm going to grab this layer. We'll grab our move tool and bring her back down into view here. So the one thing that's glaring omission here is, let's say I want to come into this and then add a layer style. So you would come over here and say plus, and I would grab this layer, right? But there is no layer styles. You can't do drop shadows. You can't do strokes. You can't do anything like that. There is no adjustment layers. So I can't come in and add all the adjustment layers you traditionally find. And there is no basic vector tools, which was kind of surprising to me that, you know, I would expect to see all the shape tools over here, but there are none. There's no shape tools at all. There's no vector tools. There's no pen tool. There is basically none of that stuff inside of this. So that's kind of a big problem in my opinion. So let's go ahead and, so you have your basic layer visibility, you have your basic masks that you can turn on and off to toggle the mask visibility, of course. But that's kind of it. If you come in here to your layer properties, that's what that little toggle right there does. You can see that you do have blend modes, and I believe all of the blend modes are in here. So you can come in here and see all the blend modes in Photoshop. I believe are also ported over into this Photoshop for iPad. But watch what happens. So I come over here to effects. This is your layer style. Sorry, it doesn't exist yet. Smart filters. You can't do any filters or smart filters. They don't exist. It just has some simple dimensions. So none of that stuff works. The only thing that does work is you do have a few what they call adjustment layers. So if I add a clipped adjustment layer, so you do have your basic brightness, contrast, color, exposure, but that's it, right? There's a few more additional ones that are inside of Photoshop that aren't here. So if we click, for example, hue and saturation, I can come in here and I can adjust the hue and saturation just like you would expect inside of Photoshop. Notice it's automatically clipped for me, so it's only affecting this single layer, which is a small change from Photoshop. By default, Photoshop doesn't clip your layers, but this one does. And then it has your basic blend mode. So that's pretty much it. So you can see here that this hue and saturation layer is clipped to the layer below it. And that's what this little icon. So if you don't want that, you can always unclip it. But by default, it adds it as a clipped layer there. And that's pretty much it. So you can, duplicate, you can copy layers, drag them around, do some basic merging. But that's it. You can see there's no filters other than this single one, which I think is curious, but they have a Gaussian blur filter is the only filter that they have supported. So you can do a Gaussian blur and, blur this thing out. But again, that is literally it. They don't have any other filters. And it's not a smart filter, it's a destructive command. As far as I can tell. Yeah, see if I go back to 0, it's still blurred. So it's not a smart blur, it is a destructive blur, Gaussian blur. And that's pretty much it. So there's definitely, it leaves a lot to be desired, I think. I am happy with the responsiveness. It behaves really snappy and responsive. But there's just so many things missing that I expect in Photoshop that there's already a slew of other iPad apps I feel out there that do drawing with basic layers and brushes much, much more robust than this app has that have been out for years and years. So again, I hope Adobe really starts to put some work behind this. It kind of feels like still a beta product. But I hope you enjoyed the review. That should give you pretty much an overview of everything you can do inside of Adobe Photoshop for iPad.